The Earth is thought to be approximately 4.6 billion years old. And for the first several hundred million years, there was no life on the Earth's surface. So it took quite a period of time for living organisms to evolve. And as we discussed in the beginnings of this chapter, there were various steps believed to be involved in the origination of life. Initially, there would have been some small organic molecules that would have formed. Some steps would have taken place to convert those or build those into larger molecules called polymers. And then there was some packaging of those molecules into a cell-like structure and the origin of probably RNA as a hereditary molecule. Now let's take a look at the first organisms that evolved and how we went from those very early organisms to all of the diversity that you see on the Earth's surface today. The very first organisms to originate are thought to have been prokaryotic cells. And this would have been approximately 3.9 to 3.5 billion years ago. Now, this is something that is supported by the fossil record. So there are fossils that show very early prokaryotic cells. Most of the very early fossils are around 3.5 billion years old, but it's thought that we probably did have life as early as 3.9 billion years ago. One of the reasons that it's believed that the prokaryotes were the first to originate is because these are very simple cells or very simple organisms. So this would have likely been the very first ones to evolve, and then later they perhaps evolved into more complicated organisms and complicated cells like we see today. Now, for quite a period of time, simple prokaryotic cells were the only cells that we had on the Earth's surface. And then when we get to about 2.7 billion years ago, there are some notable changes in the fossil record. So one thing that's noticed and that you can see in this lower picture here is there's some red coloring in the rocks. So in the strata, there's some iron oxide. And what that iron oxide is indicating is that there was the evolution of atmospheric oxygen. So by atmospheric oxygen, we're talking about O2 or oxygen gas. Now, in order for the atmosphere to suddenly gain oxygen gas, there would have had to been some changes taking place in those prokaryotic cells. The most likely change is that we did begin to get the beginnings of photosynthesis. And the process of photosynthesis does produce oxygen gas as a byproduct. So the atmospheric oxygen levels began to increase quite rapidly, and this would have changed the Earth's environment quite a lot, which may have been good for some organisms, and then for others it may have been quite detrimental. Keep in mind that the early Earth's atmosphere was very reducing. So this would have been changing that from those early conditions. If we look here, about this same time, it's thought that perhaps there were the beginnings of the eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells are more complex cells, and these are going to be cells that have a lot of internal membranes. So notice in this picture that we've got a cell that is surrounded by a plasma membrane, which is going to be a phospholipid bilayer. We then have some other membranes inside, which are beginning to divide the cell into some individual specialized compartments. Now, it is believed that there were some cells, some larger cells, that engulfed or ate some smaller cells. So these smaller cells would have been smaller prokaryotic organisms. And this is thought to have given rise to the complex eukaryotic cells that we have today. Now, this is where the mitochondria is thought to have originated. Perhaps it was at one time a very small prokaryotic cell that was engulfed by a larger prokaryotic cell. This is also thought to have happened with the chloroplast. So the chloroplast is one of those that probably was undergoing photosynthesis and contributing to those atmospheric oxygen levels. There's a bit of evidence that does indicate that this is what took place, or that the mitochondria and the chloroplast are really remnants of early prokaryotic cells. And one thing is that they have their own DNA. And this is unusual when you compare those compartments with the other compartments that we have inside the cell, such as the endoplasmic reticulum or the Golgi apparatus, lysosomes. Those individual compartments don't have their own DNA. Another thing about these is that they have their own ribosomes. So they're able to actually make some of their own proteins. Again, something that's very different from the other compartments that we have inside the cell. So when we look individually at the mitochondria and the chloroplast, we can see where they might once upon a time have been independent cells that were carrying their own hereditary information, making their own proteins, conducting their own activities. Once those cells had been engulfed, they then probably provided some sort of benefit to that host organism that had engulfed them. And so we got this symbiosis taking place. And eventually, they did remain with each other. So this is called the theory of endosymbiosis. So endo means inside. So we have a symbiosis, a mutually beneficial relationship between this smaller prokaryotic cell and then the larger host cell which had engulfed it. This is the origin, or what's thought to be the origin, of our very first eukaryotic cells. So those eukaryotic cells, if you look on this diagram here, this is going to be just a little bit older than 2 billion years ago. So maybe like 2.1 billion years ago, we're getting the first eukaryotic cells originating. So we get our first eukaryotic cells about 2.1, we said right here. And then when we get to about 1.5 billion years ago, we start to see the first multicellular eukaryotic cells. Now, the very first multicellular eukaryotes were probably colonies. And by colonies, we mean that we probably just had several or many individual cells that were living right next to each other. And they began to specialize and take on different roles for the benefit of the entire colony. So we're talking about more algae-like cells here, or more algae-like organisms in this case. And then this did originate into some more complex multicellular or eukaryotes, but we're still talking about relatively small organisms. We had a lot of multicellular aquatic organisms, and we're seeing an example of that here on this slide. So these were soft-bodied organisms. There are many fossils that indicate these were present at that time period. For quite a while, there were very simple multicellular eukaryotes. And then we did have the evolution of the animals. The evolution of the animals took place quite rapidly, really, when you look at this. And we're talking now less than 1 billion years ago. So within the last 600 million years or so, we had quite an explosion in animal diversity. Not only that, but we did then get the evolution of plants shortly following that. And so this period of time is often referred to as the Cambrian explosion. And the Cambrian explosion is this small period, relatively small when we talk about the history of the Earth's surface, but we're talking about 10 to 20 million years when life was really evolving at a very fast, rapid rate. And this is when we had most of the major phyla of animals begin to appear in the fossil record. So we go from having very simple multicellular eukaryotes to many of the different animals that we know of today. So going from very small organisms to large organisms. And the same thing happened with plants. We had a very explosive rate of evolution for different plant species. So as you can see in this picture here, it's really just the most recent history of the Earth that we began to see all of this diversity around us. If we look at all of this in regards to the geological record, we have a very long period of time which we refer to as the Precambrian era, or the Precambrian period of time. And this took about 4 billion years. When we consider that the Earth is thought to be 4.6 billion years roughly, that leaves us about 0.6 billion or 600 million years when this vast majority of life forms would have evolved. So this is quite recent in the Earth's history. As you can see on this slide right here, this is when we had the evolution of lots of different animals. So we have fish, aquatic organisms, various plants. We've got mammals, dinosaurs, humans, lots of different organisms all evolved in this last 600 million years. Another thing that we notice when we look at the fossil record is that, and geological record, is that there are lots of mass extinction events that have taken place. So why do species become extinct? Well, there's a number of theories that go along with that as to why species become extinct. But one of the main things that happens is that the environment changes. So that environment changes, and we could be talking about the physical environment. And by physical environment, things like the atmosphere may change. And that's going to be beneficial for some organisms. It's going to be detrimental for others. So if we had, say, the evolution of suddenly a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere, that might be deadly for some organisms, and we might see those suddenly become extinct. And we did see a lot of prokaryotic cells become extinct once the atmosphere did become very oxygen rich. Another thing could be the biological side, and by biological side, this could be other organisms. So we could have predators that evolve, which are now going to perhaps prey on those animals, and if there are enough predators present, they may cause an extinction to take place. We could have just habitat changes in general. So the plant life may be different. We already mentioned the physical side. The atmosphere may be different. The temperature is another thing that we want to think about here. So we've got lots of different things that could contribute to species becoming extinct. But as we look at the fossil record, we have seen this happen time and time again. The geology of the Earth has greatly impacted evolution, and it has caused many extinctions to take place. So this would fall into that physical changes that can result in extinctions. The Earth's surface is thought to be land masses that essentially float on top of hot lava. And since they're floating, they can potentially move from time to time. And we can see fault lines where these basically cracks take place where molten lava can rise up. So here's just a look at what is believed to be going on. We've got hot lava, we've got the ocean floor or the sea floor spreading and moving. So we've got lots of small changes that cause changes in the Earth's surface. This may be gradual changes like the formation of a volcano, but it could also be things like an earthquake. All of these changes can also be seen in the continents that we have on the Earth's surface. Those have not remained landlocked together, or they've not remained separated either over time. So long ago, it's thought that these were separate continents. And then they formed this one solid continent, which we call Pangaea, which you see down here. So when we had Pangaea, that was all of the continents connected together in one landmass. We did have a lot of living organisms at that time, and that solid landmass, very large landmass, would have had a very different environment than the separated land masses that we have today. So consider that you would have had a lot less coastline, a lot more we would have had a lot more arid environment there for land organisms to live on. It would have been quite different. We see that over time, right here, we start to see those land masses separate from each other and break apart. This would be due to some of those molten lava causing the seafloor to spread and the continents to shift apart from each other. And present day, now we can see that we're much more separated when we're talking about our continents. Notice that the continents today, as they are, we have much more coastline. there's going to be more exposure to the water, and we have fewer arid areas, very dry environments compared to what there would have been long ago. If we look at extinctions, over time we can see that there are numerous extinctions, mass extinctions that take place. And typically there's 5 major mass extinctions that are noted in the fossil record. If we just focus on some of the ones that are a little more commonly talked about in really very big extinction events, this one right here, that would be the Permian extinction. Lots of organisms were extinct at that point. Another one that we're going to mention here is the Cretaceous extinction. If we talk about those a little bit, the Permian extinction, this would have taken place, notice it's 250 million years ago. If we just go back to the previous slide, notice that 200 million years ago, that's when we had our big Pangaea continent. And that's when we started to have that break apart. Once it broke apart, as we said, there were going to be a lot of climate changes. So at this point, Pangaea is breaking into smaller continents, which would have drastically changed the climate for the organisms that were living there. Another major extinction is right here. That would have been the Cretaceous. And the Cretaceous is the one that's noted as having the dinosaur extinctions. So at that point, the large dinosaurs, as we see them in the fossil record now, they were extinct. And this happened very rapidly. It is one of the prevalent theories is that there was a large meteor that hit the Earth's surface, and that did result in the extinction of many organisms, and among those were the dinosaurs. Whenever we do have these mass extinctions, they're typically followed by some expansion of other groups. So when you remove a lot of organisms by extinctions, that provides new opportunities for others that may have been preyed upon before. Perhaps now their predator is extinct, so that they can now evolve into occupying a new niche in their habitat. If we just look at the mass extinctions in regard to the Earth's temperatures, we can see that most of the major extinctions do take place when we have warmer temperatures on the Earth's surface. So this is something that is often looked at when we talk about global warming. At this point in time, there are warmer temperatures than what we've seen in a lot of our past history. And it's thought that perhaps we're moving into a mass extinction event where we're going to see a lot of species disappear from the Earth's surface and disappear then from the fossil record as well.